Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents War by Other Means, the pacifists of the greatest generation who revolutionized resistance, by Daniel Akst, narrated by Justin Price. We who allow ourselves to become engaged in war need this testimony of the absolutist against us, lest we accept the warfare of the world as normative, lest we become callous to the horror of war, and lest we forget the ambiguity of our own actions and motives and the risk we run of achieving no permanent good from this momentary anarchy in which we are involved. Reinhold Niebuhr. Introduction. The first time young David Dellinger made the New York Times was on November 3, 1932, under the headline, "Yale Cub Harriers Pick Dellinger." The story, all of 2 sentences, reports that the former high school track star was elected captain of the university's freshman cross-country team. The doings of leading Yale men were news in those days, and although Dellinger was an enemy of hierarchy all his life, he was paradoxically a natural leader. Later, at New York's Union Theological Seminary, he was made president of his class. Eventually, he would become famous as a towering and uncompromising figure in radical causes. Paul Berman, an insightful historian of the post-war left, writes that during Vietnam, Dellinger became the single most important leader of the national anti-war movement. He became a great deal more famous as a member of the Chicago 7, whose trial on charges of criminal conspiracy and inciting to riot arose from their anti-war protests during the 1968 Democratic National Convention. Dellinger sat through the proceedings with awkward dignity along with co-defendants including Abby Hoffman, Jerry Rubin, and Tom Hayden, all radical celebrities in those fraught times. But surely Dellinger, the oldest of the lot, was the only one entitled to a sense of déjà vu, because he had been through something similar so long before. In 1940, as he was about to begin his second year at Union, Dellinger was the de facto leader of an idealistic band of students who had decided not to register for the nation's first peacetime draft. Long before anyone might have dreamed of the Chicago 7, newspapers across the country were reporting on the anti-war seminarians who would become known as the Union 8. Despite considerable pressure from Henry Sloan Coffin, Union's president, who was known as Uncle Henry behind his back, these young pacifists refused to avail themselves of a provision in the new draft law that was included with precisely their sort in mind. Regular or duly ordained ministers of religion and students who are preparing for the ministry in theological or divinity schools shall be exempt from training and service, but not from registration, under this act. So determined were these resistors to remain untainted by the apparatus of war that they went to federal prison, a segregated prison reflecting a segregated society, rather than violate their beliefs by filling out a piece of paper. "The war system is an evil part of our social order," the students wrote, "and we declare that we cannot cooperate with it in any way." Because their objections genuinely were religious, they probably would have been granted conscientious objector status even had they not been divinity students. "War is an evil," they wrote, "because it is in violation of the way of love as seen in God through Christ." Reinhold Niebuhr, probably the nation's leading theologian and a Union professor they had looked up to, may have been their harshest critic. A reformed pacifist himself, and perhaps therefore imbued with the zeal of the convert, he met with the students individually to try and change their minds. Dellinger's hysterical father, in a hair-raising phone call, threatened suicide. But the young men were immovable, explaining, "We do not expect to stem the war forces today, but we are helping to build the movement that will conquer in the future." These words will seem impossibly idealistic today, much like the belief that freedom could be preserved from fascist military aggression by the sheer moral force of nonviolence. Yet to a great extent, Dellinger and his fellow pacifists did conquer the future, even if he and many others left Christ behind. By 2004, when Dellinger died at the age of 88, Berman was able to put the late radical's activism into remarkable perspective. Dellinger, he said, came of an age in one of the tiniest currents of the American left, the Reverend A.J. Mustee's movement for World War II pacifism, a movement based on radical Christian values and vaguely anarchist instincts. No rational person observing that movement during the 1940s would have predicted any success at all, and yet, during the next 2 or 3 decades, Mr. Dellinger and his pacifist allies transformed whole areas of American life. That tiny current, which somehow became a tsunami of social change, has also given birth to this book, whose aim is not to make the case for absolute pacifism, but to tell the story of its remarkable adherents during its greatest trial, the Second World War. No one can dispute the horrors of war, or that opponents of our nation's many military engagements were all too often right to challenge them as pointless, unjust, or both. But it will come as a surprise to most Americans that, even after Pearl Harbor, thousands in this country opposed World War II. That's the war we all seem to approve of, the quintessential good war during which Americans pulled together and sacrificed. For the most part, they did, but it was a war thrust upon them despite their most strenuous efforts to avoid it. Before the outbreak of formal hostilities in Europe, polls showed that most Americans were firmly against U.S. involvement in yet another massive and bloody foreign conflict. Conditioned by the bitter disappointment of the Great War, which by the 1930s was widely seen as a waste and a scam, many Americans were determined not to be conned again, this time by a war erupting from an unjust peace. "You were supposed to be wised up about the war," said Mary McCarthy, explaining. "We were afraid of making a mistake, of being taken in." The evils of Nazism, visible early on only as the tip of a satanic iceberg, competed in the public mind with those of Stalinism. The lies of the Great War had bred skepticism toward alleged German atrocities. People also worried that another foreign war would beget tyranny at home, for war always increases the power of the state, and tyranny in those days seemed to be in the air, spreading like a virus from nation to nation. American civil liberties had been trampled in connection with the last European war. This time, many feared, would be worse. During the interwar period, moreover, the United States had developed perhaps the largest and best organized pacifist movement in the world. Pacifism was part of the curriculum at some schools and firmly on the agenda of the mainline Protestant denominations that were such important institutions in the life of this church-going nation at the time. Liberal clergymen, including such celebrity ministers as the indefatigable Harry Emerson Fosdick, spoke out against war from their Sunday pulpits and via the popular new medium of radio, whence the gospel of pacifism reached a student by the name of Martin Luther King Jr. Pacifism was well established on campuses thanks to a massive and diverse national student anti-war movement, with thousands pledging not to fight under any circumstances. Even after the Nazi invasion of Poland, some people could find little basis for choosing between the growing array of combatants. Alliances were shifting, and there were more uncomfortable parallels between the imperialist Western powers and their enemies. Hitler's persecution of the Jews was widely condemned, even if the final solution was not yet apparent to outsiders. But why was it fine for Britain to occupy India and wrong for Germany to occupy Poland, or even France? Why not go to war with the Soviet Union, which invaded not just Poland, but Finland and the Baltic states too? "If we see that Germany is winning, we ought to help Russia," Harry Truman would suggest on the Senate floor. "And if Russia is winning, we ought to help Germany." But when Hitler's panzers turned on Western Europe, more Americans began to side with the Allies, and the mass pacifism of the interwar years began to dissolve. After Pearl Harbor, which surprised nearly everyone by bringing war to America from Asia, domestic opposition to entering the struggle collapsed. Yet against all odds, and perhaps all reason, some Americans adhered so doggedly to the principle of nonviolence that they persisted in opposing the fight. About 43,000 men were granted conscientious objector status once the draft law of 1940 took effect, out of at least 72,000 who applied. Most were purely religious objectors, and some contributed to the war effort as combat medics or in other non-lethal roles. About 12,000, unwilling to cooperate in military activities, accepted assignment to a far-flung network of rural work camps run by the traditional peace churches in uneasy partnership with government. A small number of resistors were radical pacifists whose opposition to war was, or would soon be, part of a vastly more ambitious reformist impulse. Not all these radicals were religious, and some who were grew less so. Some were granted CO status, and some weren't, the haphazard local adjudication system inevitably producing widely disparate results. And some, like Dellinger, refused to seek that status. Extreme pacifist is the best description I can think of. Christopher Isherwood wrote of them a few years after the war. But it is unsatisfactory and vague, for the group combined several sorts of anarchists, individualists, religious and non-religious objectors. Some of them had refused even to register for the draft, holding that registration itself implies acceptance of the military machine. Isherwood's description serves well enough. Of the roughly 6,000 Americans who went to prison for refusing to cooperate with the war in any way, most were apolitical Jehovah's Witnesses, whose confinement reflected the government's refusal to accept that everyone in the church was a minister. That left nearly 2,000 absolute resistors, a small number that belies a large impact. For the most radical resistors, who emerged from the experience hardened against prison, poverty, and social disrepute, the war became a laboratory for developing the ideas and approaches they and others would employ in the turbulent decades ahead to bring about some of the most important social changes in this country since the end of slavery. During the war, white and black pacifists attacked segregation with teamwork, negotiation, and sit-down strikes. They fought to reform mental health care at home and to halt the bombings of civilians overseas. They protested the herding of Japanese Americans into remote concentration camps. They railed, avant la lettre, against the military-industrial complex that was plainly on the horizon. Most of all, influenced by Gandhi, they transformed their pacifism from a philosophy of wartime refusal into an active, nonviolent system for confronting and defeating injustice. Thus, the title of this book. For the World War II pacifists, nonviolence was not merely a way of living or a matter of resistance. It was frankly aggressive, a way of actually fighting, and something religious pacifists in particular had historically avoided. In today's terms, we might see these new pacifists sought to weaponize nonviolence by translating moral authority into power. In doing so, they helped synthesize something new and distinctly modern from a blend of Gandhian nonviolence and Protestant resistance, something suitable to the political, cultural, and technological environment of their own country and culture. The elements were already there. Gandhi, after all, had been influenced by Jesus as well as by Thoreau, and Gandhi, in turn, had already influenced leaders of the nascent civil rights movement in this country. American pacifists, influenced as well by organized labor, worked during the war to develop a distinctive approach that amounted to nothing less than war by other means. Practically speaking, there was little they could do to halt the terrible conflict of World War II, but at the very least they could call the world's democracies to conscience. When, in 1942, the Roosevelt administration interned 110,000 Japanese Americans, opponents of the war were among the few who cried foul. When the Allies, at the 1943 Casablanca Conference, adopted a policy of unconditional surrender, pacifists including Dellinger, Dorothy Day, and Dwight MacDonald called instead for a negotiated peace that might yet, they hoped, save some of Europe's Jews. Musty repeatedly urged FDR to raise immigration quotas for European Jewry before it was wiped out, and when the Allies intentionally bombed civilians, the nation's lonely remaining pacifists lost no time in decrying the immorality and hypocrisy of the action. One such unpopular protest in 1944 made the front page of the New York Times. All the while, war resistors were developing the techniques they would later use to far greater effect. It was during the war that they refined direct action as a means of protest, a media-conscious style of nonviolent confrontation suitable for revealing injustice to its perpetrators and their constituents. Locked up, during the war, 1 in 6 federal inmates was a prisoner of conscience, or relegated to a remote archipelago of civilian public service (CPS) camps. Pacifists from different walks of life got to know each other in facilities that threw together city boys and farmers, Christians and communists, whites and blacks, naifs and sophisticates in bubbling cauldrons of radicalism. Behind bars and in the dusty outposts where they worked on irrigation projects and the like, these young men argued, plotted, and educated one another, holding classes and publishing newsletters. Thus did federal efforts to manage the pacifists only radicalize them further, hardening them against social pressure and empowering them to school one another in the tactics of dissent. It was an extraordinary opportunity to hone the nonviolent techniques that would later propel the nation through a period of wrenching progress with far less bloodshed than might have been. "The biggest single mistake the government made," said Roy Kepler, one of the more radical, conscientious objectors, "was introducing us to each other." Faced with a widely supported battle against fascism and a booming economy, pacifists had good reason to shift their focus from war to the injustices they saw at its root. The most egregious injustice of all, one connected with the colonialism that was a perennial casus belli in their minds, was America's treatment of its black citizens. During the war, white and black pacifists founded the Congress of Racial Equality, an important civil rights organization that was sustained in its infancy by Mustee's Pacifist Fellowship of Reconciliation, 4. The war resistors and civil rights activists Bayard Rustin and James Farmer were crucial human links between wartime radical pacifism and the civil rights struggles to come, struggles that succeeded in large part because they were nonviolent. The ramifications rippled outward in all directions. Opposition to the war shattered America's once thriving Socialist Party and discredited a healthy strain of non-interventionism in U.S. foreign policy. It encouraged progressives to turn from labor, which supported the war, toward racial justice, and it established the basis for decades of progressive antagonism toward American militarism. It fostered chronic suspicion of government power and pronouncements, and it gave birth to the tactics of nonviolent direct action that would figure so prominently in the years to come. In the history of progressive change in this country, resistance to the Second World War is the crucial missing link. After the war, resistors brought their ideals and experience to bear in agitating for nuclear disarmament, ending colonialism, and overturning apartheid. Their dogged idealism, honed in lonely opposition to a popular war, fitted them to withstand years in the wilderness during the 1950s. Eventually, as part of a groundswell of change, some of them would become important figures in the civil rights movement, which in turn gave impetus to the women's movement and the movement for gay rights. World War II pacifists would play a leading role in burying the conscription they loathed and help to drag America out of Vietnam. By now, opposition to militarism is a staple of the American left, even if wars large and small have continued to this day. More important, the pacifists of World War II helped make the country many of us take for granted, a nation that approves of gay marriage, grants women something approaching equality, and elected a black president named Barack Hussein Obama. Another group of World War II opponents had an enduring impact as well, but mainly by their absence, much like an eldest son full of promise but killed in battle. These were the Americans who fell into the impossibly broad category of isolationists, some avowedly and some unwillingly, and they present interesting parallels to their radical pacifist counterparts. In both groups, anti-war feeling arose from disillusionment with the Great War and concern for civil liberties, which both sides were certain would yield to tyranny in the event we were drawn into another European conflict. Both groups were largely Protestant and anti-imperialist, and both were more internationally minded than people give them credit for. In both groups, paradoxically, we can detect a yearning for a simpler and more intimate America, a locally oriented society thick with personal relations, mutual understanding, and a kind of love, a place already fading in 1940, and whose demise was in fact accelerated by the national war effort. All parties would have agreed with John Dewey, who wrote at the time, "The serious threat to our democracy is not the existence of foreign totalitarian states. It is the existence within our own personal attitudes and within our own institutions of conditions similar to those which have given a victory to external authority, discipline, uniformity, and dependence upon the leader in foreign countries. The battlefield is also accordingly here, within ourselves and our institutions." The isolationists and radical pacifists ultimately failed to deter American war-making, even if today's leftists and libertarians still live by Dewey's words. For a fleeting moment before December 7th, 1941, the two sides sometimes worked in wary tandem to form a kind of anti-war peaceable kingdom, finding ways to cooperate despite deep ideological differences. Imagine some noisy, latter-day Edward Hicks painting of Norman Thomas, Herbert Hoover, H.L. Mencken, James Farmer, Paul Goodman, Dorothy Day, Charles Beard, Charles Lindbergh, A.J. Muste, and even Elijah Muhammad, all united in aim if not in outlook. Following America's horrible date which will live in infamy, former isolationists patriotically took up arms, but their pre-war cause, tragically misunderstood by later generations, never recovered. As a result, America was left largely without the strong, establishment anti-interventionist voices it badly needed in the decades to come. Such voices might have curtailed more than half a century of ill-advised international adventures, from the overthrow of elected governments in Guatemala and Iran to such fiascos as the Bay of Pigs, Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan. World War II was, of course, the ultimate challenge to nonviolence. Given public opinion, how should pacifists conduct themselves? Was there any sense in protesting? What actions could a pacifist in good conscience undertake? And how could the menace of fascism be halted with nonviolence? There were as many answers to these questions as there were pacifists. For the most part, they saw opposition to war as a moral and religious imperative that was inviolable regardless of its consequences. In studying the war's pacifist opponents, I found it impossible not to admire their radical anti-authoritarianism. Like the Pilgrims, our pacifists were dissenters, a word that has always had religious connotations, and their dogma was nonviolence. They sought not to vanquish their opponents, but to convert them. Understandably, given that in the Christian tradition nobody is beyond redemption. Again and again these nonconformists showed not just moral but physical courage. They calmly withstood imprisonment, assault, forced feedings, and solitary confinement, insisting on the role of conscience despite the mortal threat posed by powerful enemies in a global war. They were wrong about one very big thing, it is true, but they were right about many others, as time would tell. In their own way, they fought for freedom just as their countrymen did, even if one might wish they had acknowledged their debt to the Americans who fought on the battlefield. It's noteworthy that the American Civil Liberties Union, ACLU, arose from a precursor called the National Civil Liberties Bureau, which focused on protecting anti-war speech and conscientious objectors during the Great War. American pacifists in the Second World War were similarly concerned with liberty as well as peace, which was in keeping with the long anti-authoritarian history of Anglo-American pacifism. It's largely a religious tradition, and the churches most identified with nonviolence, the Quakers, for example, are descended from 16th and 17th century reformers who were skeptical toward authority and placed conscience above worldly power. The pacifists who encountered a world at war starting in 1939 did likewise. They recoiled from violence, but also from the pervasive power of mass society. They saw the state as flawed, coercive, and corrupt, in the words of one wise student of the era's radicals, and a strong anarchist streak ran through many of the most ardent resistors, who naturally believed they were answering to a higher power. War, to them, was the very worst manifestation of an increasingly regimented technological society that many people are reacting against still. They insisted that America live up to its values, no matter what was at stake. And, in keeping with their country's venerable reform tradition, they had faith, for the most part Protestant faith, although some had socialist faith. Foreshadowing evangelicals yet to come, they believed they were walking with Jesus, just as had their intellectual and political forebears who crusaded to protect the Indians, end slavery, tamp down tippling, achieve women's suffrage, and otherwise bring American life more in line with divinity. Those impulses were largely quiescent when the new war broke out, by which time liberal Protestants were the establishment. Radical pacifism revived religious protest in America, turning its focus to all the work yet left undone. This book ranges widely to offer an account of the war from the perspective of its opponents, but focuses on a handful of individuals who would go on to play an important part in the social and political changes to come. They include that consummate radical David Dellinger, the brilliant and charismatic Bayard Rustin, the compulsive dissident Dwight MacDonald, and the visionary Catholic anarchist Dorothy, as well as less known but important anti-war figures such as James Farmer, A.J. Muste, Harry Emerson Fosdick, and George Hauser. Consider this a snapshot in their pilgrimage as well as our own, an image filled with characters and events that speaks of their time but also contains clues to our own. Through these individuals, we'll recognize the modern progressive movement emerging, the resistors' loathing of hierarchy, their suspicion of the modern state, and their keen devotion to personal autonomy and moral hygiene, which shape the character of the left into the 21st century and make it impossible for them to build enduring political organizations. The predilections of the good war refuseniks are detectable in the rights revolution we now take for granted and the near pacifism that prevails among modern-day progressives. The CO's preference for consensus over authority can be found in the shape and governance of the Internet, and their combination of moral outrage and organizational reticence was evident in Occupy Wall Street. Their emphasis on race, complicated by immigration, gender, and sexuality, has metastasized into an obsession. The essentially libertarian orientation of the resistors, who would have agreed with Milton Friedman that conscription was slavery, the religious roots of their ethics, and their wariness of central authority are all commonplace in significant precincts of today's political culture. This speaks partly to their influence, but also to their all-American political DNA. Their stress on personal conscience, to cite a single strand, goes all the way back to the Puritans. Part 1. Before. Chapter 1. And now, Youth. David Dellinger and his friend Don Benedict caught a ride from New York to Washington, D.C. for the Lincoln's birthday weekend of 1940. Who knows where they stayed? On somebody's floor, probably. It was the Depression, and Dellinger in particular knew all about roughing it. Benedict was hoping to learn from him on that score. They were in Washington because the two of them were part of a youth movement whose eager vanguard had descended on the city to agitate for jobs, rights, peace, and what they saw as justice. Both had backgrounds in the important Christian student movements of the era, Dellinger at Yale and Benedict at Albion, a little Methodist college in Michigan, and both now were graduate students at Union Theological Seminary in New York. There, Dellinger had quickly formed a close bond with Benedict and Meredith Dallas, also from Albion. Pacifism, like socialism, was in the air at Union, at least among students. It was an exciting time, even if, like W.H. Auden, America's young, having lived through a low, dishonest decade, could feel the waves of anger and fear circulate over the bright and darkened lands of the earth, obsessing our private lives. The students who made their way to Washington that weekend had come of an age in the Great Depression. America's collegians, once apathetic, were now far more conscious of injustice, chafing under the political constraints imposed by paternalistic faculty and administrators, and determined to stay out of war. It was a time when frats, like the football team, were losing their glamour, wrote the playwright Arthur Miller, recalling his days at the University of Michigan, class of 1938. Instead, my generation...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?